Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week we are once again joined by Annie Whitehead, whom last time she was on we discussed Mercia, the rise and fall of a kingdom, which I would absolutely recommend checking out. And this week she's back, as I said, to discuss a recent book which came out, I believe, in March, and I'm of course holding it up here. It's called Murder in Anglo Saxon England, Justice, Verdict, Revenge. So it's quite like I said, it's kind of true crime set in Anglo-Saxon in the 5th to the 10th century. So what made you write this book about I thought, oh, I'm going to write a book about murder in Anglo-Saxon England. Where did you get that idea about?
Yeah, it's a strange one. So I spend almost all of my life just writing, reading about, researching Anglo-Saxon history. And I just found that time and again I was talking or reading or writing about particular murder stories. And just one day it occurred to me, well, how many of these are there out there? And the ones that I talk about a lot, I don't think are true. So, where did these legends come from? What's the story behind them? How many can I find? And then it sort of got a bit deeper, and I thought, what does it actually tell us about society at the time? And more importantly, I think, what does it tell us about the people who were chronicling the history? And if those stories weren't true, then why might that be? And so I put the idea to the publisher and they said, yes, great, go ahead. So that's how the idea was born, really.
And people do love a good murder story, don't we?
They do, yeah, and I did find it's an abiding interest. I mean, true crime modern day is not really my kind of thing. I'm much happier, if that's the right word,
So
dealing
you're
with
not an
people.
Agatha Christie girl then?
Not really, no, but I do love the Anglo-Saxon era, and I do love the some of the more outlandish and literally fantastic tales. And yeah, I suppose I did kind of get my detective's hat on a little
Mm.
bit and start to investigate and think about motives and circumstantial evidence. And, were people in the right place at the right time? And did they have alibis and what was going on? And yeah, it was a lot of fun to research and write, I have to say.
So your book take place throughout 5 centuries, like I said, from the 5th to the 10th centuries. So, but and as you write about in the book, people didn't seem to like you said, murder occurred, obviously, but like as it does today. But people didn't seem too much concerned about murder necessarily, as to say to other crimes. So let's talk. Why do you think that was? For example, as you say in the book, they are more concerned about theft than
Yeah.
say murder.
Yeah, that was probably something that I maybe knew, but I hadn't really thought about. Because I thought if I'm going to talk about murder, which is, we consider very much breaking the law, then I really need to go back and remind myself about what the laws say. And I think some people might be surprised to know that we do have written law codes going right back to the 7th century. But when I've really examined them closely, I thought I can't find much about punishment for murder, certainly not capital punishment. And it quickly became obvious that you're much more likely in that time to be executed for theft than you are for murder. And so the Weregild, which is part of the title of the book, is all about this system of man price compensation. So if you commit really any kind of felony, the usual punishment is that you have to pay a fine, usually to your victim, or if they're dead, to their family. And this was a system, it wasn't unique to the Anglo Saxons. A lot of other countries and civilizations had this kind of system. But it seems on the face of it to have worked pretty well because it kind of controls the situation. If you're busting for a fight and your brother knows that if you get killed or the other person gets killed, he might be liable to pay the fine. He might start to try and talk you out of it. So I think the idea behind it was to kind of keep a lid on feuding.
Mm.
Didn't always work. But yeah, I started to look at other periods of history. And if we go right back up to Victorian times, people are still being hanged for
Mm.
theft. Children are being hanged
Yeah,
for theft. It's like for the people
I'm
who
reading
rule.
a a book. I don't remember the author's name. Actually, let me check that out. It's quite funny you should mention that because I'm reading by Roy Porter. I think it is. He wrote about 18th century English society, and where he wrote that 7-year-old girls would be hanged for theft. So yeah, it's true that almost up until modern times we have children being hanged or killed for murder, for theft or stealing.
Yeah, there was a very harsh fines in the Anglo Saxon period for housebreaking, burglary, breaking and entering. So again, it's all centering around how important property is. And some of the laws relating to the weregild, they actually class the people as property. So, if you were to damage somebody's slave, it depends what class of slave they are, as to how much you have to pay. So yeah, it's all based around property and belongings, and I think to a certain extent, going right through the ages, it's sort of all economy based as well. If you're damaging someone's income, if you're upsetting the natural order of trade and the economy as a whole, then theft is pretty awful. But they didn't seem to care that much about murder. In the early period, you've got obviously we only know about the high profile
Yeah.
cases. The chroniclers weren't interested in what was going on in the average street in the average town kind of thing.
It's not like today that where you would have a podcast immediately if someone,
Yeah,
if some
exactly.
average person murders when they're killing a spree, and you would
Yeah.
immediately have a 5 to 10 podcasts talking about it.
Yeah, so we and maybe the laws. Well, I know for a fact there's no maybe about it. When we get into the later period that's covered by the book, that the higher ranks of the nobility are completely operating outside the law, and they're committing murder not only with impunity, but either with the agreement of their king or on the orders of their king. So, again, it's like it's almost not even considered murder. It's just this person needs to be removed from the scene. So could you please sort it? And I don't care how bloody that event is. Yeah, I found it really, really interesting. And that was an aspect that I hadn't really thought about. I knew that so many of the stories are likely not true, but I hadn't really sort of thought about how they corresponded to the laws that were in place at the time. So that was a really interesting aspect of the research for me.
So I want to go to the early Anglo-Saxon time, and I'm talking pre-Christianity here, because obviously, and I think you talked about this in the book as well. On scripture writing only come with Christianity and Christianization of Anglo-Saxon world. So, what do we know anything about murder and theft in society of pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon society?
Not really, because as you say, that with Christianity comes literacy. That's when we get the written record.
But if I may, what about archaeological evidence from that time?
There's not so much that was helpful for this particular book. I mean, mainly I was concentrating on, yeah, well, I started with the sort of what you might call the conversion period. So some of the high profile cases did involve pagans that then converted, or converted because they'd had a very close brush with death. And that made them sort of rethink their values slightly. But the archaeological evidence for murder, we don't get so much from the pagan burials. The grave goods tell us a lot about the pagan burials, and obviously when you move into the Christian period, then you don't get so much in the way of grave goods. But it doesn't tell us a whole lot about the attitudes to murder. One thing that I will say is that there is a huge body of thinking that these early law codes were codifying and writing down systems that had already been in existence. And it was very much the sort of Germanic code that the early law codes were based on. So, there is that aspect to it. But I mean, I started with a very high profile case that in fact wasn't murder, but could so easily have been. And that was the attempted assassination of a 7th century Northumbrian king. And he when he became king of Northumbria, he was a pagan. And the kings were gradually at this time converting to Christianity. I'm going to be really, really cynical. I don't mean to sound irreligious when I say this, but you do. Certainly, it seems to me that a lot of those early kings were converting for political reasons because it suited them, and they were waiting for a time where it would most benefit them and their alliances. So I'm not, and a lot of them quite often very quickly changed their minds and went back to their old pagan practices. So the conversion period was not everybody suddenly seeing the light and converting all at once. It took time. And I think everybody had their own individual reasons for doing so. But again, we only hear about the ones who did convert and stay Christian because we're hearing about these people from Christian monks who are writing their stories. So you do get, a kind of pretty much one-sided view. So you will find that, great Christian kings get a fantastic write-up, and anybody who remained resolutely pagan will get more of a bad press. And it's that kind of bias and you need to think about why these people are writing what they're writing, and therefore why they're telling us what they're telling us. So that was a huge part of unpicking all these documents and all these sources and saying, okay, well, who is this? What did they have to gain? What were they trying to tell us? What was their motivation? And then try and find some corroborating evidence for these murder stories, just to see if we could get somewhere near the truth. Obviously, we don't have any living witnesses, so we can't ever know for sure. There is one case in the book from the later period where the archaeological evidence and the documentary evidence tie up so completely that we have absolutely no doubt what went on.
So let's begin as you do, and we spoke kind of a little bit about this already, but I want to talk some more about law codes and sources. Like you say, you mentioned some, but Bede obviously is one of those sources you use. But let's talk a little bit about law codes for early Anglo-Saxon and era. Like you said, they were writing already established law codes from early practices, but did some laws change with Christianity as Christianity came? That how did things change with religion?
The law codes do get more detailed as we go on. So, and I don't want to give the impression that we have loads of them. We don't. We have proportionately, I suppose, a lot more from the early period. So we have laws from Kent and from what became known as Wessex. We don't have any for Northumbria, and we don't have any really for Mercia. There were law codes in Mercia, we know that. Famously, Alfred the Great of Wessex, when he was formulating his law codes, he said that he had used Offa of Mercia's law codes for some of his, but they didn't survive for whatever reason, I don't know. So we know that King Offa the Great of Mercia did have law codes, so that's from the 8th century. We have some from the 7th century, but not all the kingdoms. Now, whether they ever existed and didn't survive, we don't know. But we've got Alfred the Great's laws, and then from Alfred onwards, most kings seem to have had their own law codes. They issued them. Quite often they're building on previous ones, so they're not necessarily adding that much. But what you do find as the time goes on and we get into the 10th century and beyond, that they're very much focusing on, they are issuing these laws as a Christian king, the leader of Christian peoples and Christian kingdoms. And Alfred's, there's a preface to his laws which reads very, very much like the Ten Commandments. So there's much more of a religious aspect to a lot of it. And we do get little changes, and we start to find things in Athelstan's law code. So Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, that's when we first start hearing about criminals being denied burial in consecrated ground. So that's something that's new. Athelstan changed the law regarding the age of responsibility. So initially, he set the age of criminal responsibility at 12, which sounds really quite brutal. And then he says that after consultation with his advisors, he's decided to change that to 15. And we go, oh, phew, but that's still pretty barbaric. Until you remember that in this country, in the UK, the age of criminal responsibility, even now, is 10. Now, all right, we're not hanging children anymore. We're not hanging.
Fortunately.
We're not hanging any. The age of criminal.
Just one second. It says, yeah, we had some brief technical difficulties. I apologize for that. But yeah, we were talking about criminal responsibility, and like I said, fortunately, and like you said, unfortunately, we don't hang kids anymore. But back then, because like we said earlier, it was pretty much a common, I wouldn't say common thing until the 18th century. But yeah, let's talk about go back to criminal responsibilities.
Yeah, so like I say, Athelstan originally set the age of criminal responsibility at 12, and then after consulting with his advisors, changed it to 15. You know, compared with today, where in this country it's 10. You know, suddenly it starts to seem, oh, it's not that barbaric. Or they are still hanging people.
Mm.
Again, I think the idea is possibly linked to the economy, in that you've got to think about the age at which a child becomes part of the economy. They're working, they're contributing. And so, in most regards, in that age, they're probably deemed to be adults.
And
So,
if I may, we do have to take in mind that at least, and this still is true as well, I think, up until somewhat 18th, 19th century, the age of becoming a man was about 12, 15 years. So we have to take that to almost consider, and I don't know if that's true for Anglo Saxon world as well, but later in history, of course, you do have the age of being a man being about 12, 15 years. So,
yeah.
and you had child marriages at 12, 10 years old as well in history. So it's when you take a look at the broadest perspective, as brutal as this may sound, it doesn't sound too out of place
No, no.
for criminal responsibility when you take a broader perspective of this.
Yeah, and context is everything. I mean, in the 10th century, King Edgar became king, we think, round about the age of 14 or 15. So we're talking about a society that is quite happy to have a teenager on the throne. So I think we've come a long way. You know, in the 20th and the 21st century, laws have changed so much. I mean, the Children Act, I think, in the UK came into force in 1979, and we protect children so much more now than we used to. But yeah, by and large, they're not getting. There is very little actually at all in the law codes about murder. That the fines are set, but capital punishment for murder is just really not so much of a thing. Even in those very early days, there are fantastic details about the law codes and exactly what you can expect to have to pay if you damage someone else. That the fines are set. If you damage one eye, you'll pay less than if you damage both eyes. There's differentiation between if you damage an ear or if the whole ear comes off. There's literally everything, and it's almost comical, the detail, but then you stop and you think, well, this is designed to show exactly what will happen if you start a brawl, have a few drinks too many. This is exactly what you can expect. This is how much you'll have to pay. And if you can't pay it, then your kinship group will have to pay it, and they won't be very happy with you. So I think, in a way, and the fact that we don't hear too much about these feuds going out of control, probably on the whole, certainly, as I say, in Mr. Average and Mr. Average Street and Mr. Average Town, it's probably, by and large, the laws are working. It's the top tiers of society where they they seem to consider themselves above the law. But there's a very, very interesting case from the slightly later period that really, I think, sums it up. So there was this guy who kept stealing what his neighbour said was his land. And 3 times he was hauled up before the king and told to stop it and behave himself and give the land back. And 3 times he refused. He was punished quite severely. His sister was punished for helping him. They were both exiled. But in the course of all this story, what everybody at the time seems to have overlooked, at one point, this guy's wife gathered up a posse of her relatives, went storming over to the neighbour's land, and they killed them all. I think about 12 people, if I recall correctly. Nothing is mentioned in this detailed case about what happened to her. The focus is purely on the theft of the land, not the fact that she gathered all these relatives and went on a killing spree. We're not told what happened to her, because it doesn't seem to have been that important. It was the lawsuit about the land that was the important thing at the time. So I think that just gives a really good example of kind of where the priorities were, unless, and it's a big unless, you were breaking the king's peace. If you were doing something on the king's land or against the king's person, that was a different matter. But the kings were sanctioning murder as well, certainly in the later period, and killing each other in the early period. That's the main difference between the two. In the early period, you've got lots of kings trying to establish their own kingdoms and trying to establish their own dynasties. So it is more a story of, Guy A becomes king, and then Guy B comes along and kills him and sits on the throne for a while until Guy C comes along and ousts him. So there's a lot of that going on in the early period as the Anglo Saxon kingdoms, as they came to be, are sort of becoming established. But
So, as you write in the book, their dynasties was almost impossible to establish in. So you wonder why there weren't many dynasties in the Anglo-Saxon era, but that may be because, like you said, they murdered usually each other, and it wasn't necessarily always the case that the son would inherit the throne after his father.
Yeah. Well, firstly, they didn't have primogeniture. There was no cast iron guarantee that the eldest son of the king would automatically succeed. Kings had to be elected by the council, the Witan. But also, it really helped if you were an adult. That if you were, say, the brother of the previous king and you were grown up, you're gonna have more of a chance of becoming king than any children that he might have left behind, because very, very early on this was a warrior society. You needed to be able to fight. I did say in the book that the most successful kings, the ones who seem to have less trouble with people trying to take their throne from them, were the ones who had a really, really good foreign policy and were very strong and were attacking other kingdoms. And if you manage to get control of other kingdoms, then you're getting wealth, you're getting taxes, you're getting tribute. So I'm not sure which came first, whether the strong kings were naturally able to diminish any rival claimants, or whether the ones who didn't have rival claimants were more free to concentrate on foreign policy, as it were. So a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, that one. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stories. Northumbria in the 8th century is just one long list of kings ruling, sometimes for a matter of days, and kings' sons seeking sanctuary in churches and being dragged out and murdered. And it's absolutely vicious in the early period. It really was.
And I just used one example here, and by each chapter you have, and this is from chapter 13. So you have listed in most chapters the name of the people murdered as well. So, and it's like, let me count them: 1, 2, 3, 5 different people murdered in just one chapter. So it's quite a lot of murders going on as well.
Yes. A lot of them, I say, the early ones are mainly in sort of 7th and 8th centuries, it is a story of kings trying to establish their dominance. But then in the middle period, we get all these kind of weird tales about, little tiny children being murdered by their female relatives, and then it becomes a lot more interesting. And the one case where King Offa of Mercia's daughter was accused of poisoning her husband, who was the king of the West Saxons. She didn't mean to, but that doesn't mean she was innocent, because apparently she was actually trying to poison his advisor because she was very jealous of him, and the king drank the poison. And then this tale of her stealing all the jewels and
Kind of
running.
reminds me of Kronk, not gonna lie.
Well, it's such a fascinating story because we do have a source which is more contemporary than some of the others. But when I dug down into the bones of this story, it does seem much more likely that this king, her husband, was actually killed in battle. We have a chronicle that says there was a battle. This king was victorious. He'd actually been driven into exile by his wife's, by the previous this lady's husband and her father, King Offa. So he's back, and he's literally back with a vengeance. And so I thought that maybe the scenario is that her husband's died on the battlefield. He's been killed by the guy that he ousted and drove into exile. Is she going to hang around and see how merciful he is? Or is she going to gather up what riches she can and make her escape? So, there's quite a lot of stories where women get a really, really bad press, particularly from the slightly later chroniclers, where we get nothing from contemporary sources. So King Offa's wife was accused of inciting him to murder. And there was a Northumbrian scholar who was living in Charlemagne's court, who knew the family, who wrote letters to her son. He praised her. He wrung his hands at what was going on in Northumbria at the time, and he said that the first, the famous Viking raid on Lindisfarne was a punishment for all the killing that was going on. But he wrote in really glowing terms about this lady. But the later chroniclers accused her of having a hand in murder. And I thought, well, who are we more likely to believe here? Somebody who actually knew her and wrote to her son saying, you should learn compassion from your mother? Or do we believe the later chroniclers? And why are the later chroniclers adding so much more detail to these stories? They're fantastic stories to read. I mean, the detail is just, it's phenomenal. They build these stories up so much. But these poor women, on the whole, are getting a really, really bad press. And I think it's partly because some of them had disputes with the church about their property, about their land, about the abbeys. So they wouldn't be very kindly remembered by the monks who were then writing the histories. But also, around about the 12th century, church attitudes to women did change quite substantially. And so there may have been, a little bit of misogyny playing a part there as well.
Now, we mentioned a little bit earlier about the punishment for crimes and murder, but was there prisons in Anglo-Saxon England, or was there how were there prison sentences in the world of Anglo-Saxon England?
There is some evidence for it. In the law codes, we see that the local lords were responsible for keeping thieves in custody. So the inference has to be that they had somewhere secure to keep them. There isn't any evidence for chains and shackles. Nothing like that's ever been found. But they must have been securely locked up. And we have anecdotal evidence as well. It's not just in the law codes, the responsibilities of the lords to make sure that criminals were locked up. There's also a famous story that comes from the reign of Athelred the Unready, when his son Edmund Ironside, Athelred had ordered some killings, as he was wont to do, and famously 2 leading nobles had been killed, and one of their wives was imprisoned, we're told. And then Edmund Ironside, it's a very romantic story. He sprang her from prison and then married her. No idea whether this was a consensual marriage. We don't know what she thought about it. But obviously she was being imprisoned somewhere. So yeah,
It can't have been a happy marriage.
I wouldn't have thought so. I wouldn't have thought so. I think they probably knew each other. They were in the same kind of court circle. But it's a huge leap from knowing somebody who is a mate of your husband's to actually wanting to marry him when you've just been widowed. But of course, when he married her, he got then automatically the lands and the loyalty of the people who lived on those lands. So it was bolstering his support. So it's maybe not quite so romantic a tale as it looks on first reading. But yeah, she was imprisoned, and we know in the 950s, Wulfstan, the Archbishop of York, he had a really, really difficult relationship with King Edward, and for a time we're told that he was imprisoned as well. And some of the later sources do say that he was kept in chains, but there is no chains of that type have been found from the period. So we can't say it didn't happen, but we can't prove that it did.
It wasn't like a medieval dungeon that you imagine from novels or movies and such.
I don't think so. I mean, also we've got to remember that these people are not living in stone castles. So, but I mean, they did have locks and keys, so it's perfectly possible that you can lock a door, and obviously you
I mean,
guard
if you have
these people.
keys, I assume that would be the case.
Yeah. So that, yeah, there is a responsibility. If a lord finds a thief on his property, then he has to keep him for. It's specified how many days. Slightly different with different law codes, but obviously, if there's an obligation to keep someone under lock and key, then you have to have the wherewithal to do that.
Now, I want to talk about, because you mentioned earlier, of course, that the high society was about the law, but I want to ask, because if you say a high society person murdered a slave or a peasant worker, and could they get away with it? And what would be the crime if vice versa happened? If, say, a slave were murdering his master, or if a peasant person murdered a high society person, what would it be? Of course, there's difference, as you can say, is the case today, even that there's a difference between high society law, between high society and you and me. But was there different? What's the difference in crimes and punishments? Punishment difference if, say, a high society person murdered someone in their own class, or in their someone a slave or a peasant, or vice versa.
Well, technically, if a lord, say, were to murder a slave or a servant, they would have to pay the weregild to that person's family, not for the slaves. Unfortunately, the slaves did not have the same rights at all, and there's no getting around it. The Anglo Saxons did have slaves. We know this. If it worked the other way, the honest answer is I don't think we know, because we don't have any recorded cases really of that happening, where a low-born person murdered a high-born person. There's one famous story about King Edmund in the 10th century who was killed, and the story goes that he was killed by a lowly thief. And this thief was actually wrestled to the ground by the king's servants and was killed himself. So, there was instant retribution, as it were. But when I looked into that story, the idea of this guy being a common lowly thief doesn't hold a lot of water, because apparently he'd been exiled and he'd managed to come back, and he'd managed to get himself a seat at the high table at a king's feast. And it all starts to sound a little implausible, and it's possible that he was actually paid, in effect, to get the king out of the way. So we just don't have the evidence. I'm sure retribution would be swift, but people are playing hard and fast with the rules. So, towards the later period, the end of the 10th century, kings were killed. Famously, I mean, the clue is in his name, Edward the Martyr, who was the elder half-brother of Athelred the Unready, was killed. Some say his stepmother was involved in the killing. Nobody was punished for his murder. Technically, Weregild should have been sought, it should have been paid, but it seems to have been slightly brushed under the carpet. Athelred did a lot to preserve his half-brother's memory, a saintly cult built up very, very quickly, and there is this sense that Athelred knew that the murder had been committed for his benefit. He was a child at the time. It's very unlikely that he would have been involved or that he would even have known if there was a plot, but he clearly benefited from it because he then became king. And he did seem to go out of his way to try to compensate for that. But nobody was ever brought to justice. So, it does seem that some people really are getting away with it. And sometimes they are killing because the kings told them to. The kings are ordering these killings, which is, slightly chilling.
So, and we kind of touched upon this already, but I want to ask a little bit further. How often did murder occur in Anglo-Saxon England? Like, was it a weekly event, or was it like maybe once a year, once every third year? I mean, I'm imagining, of course, in war and such, people die, obviously, but like murder for regular murder, for the lack of better words. Do we know how often that occurred? And of course, we have, like you said, I don't know, do an example here because we talked about dueling with Eleanor Janner already a few years ago now, where we say that it didn't occur as much as we think it is. It's only because we had the written sources that we think it actually occurred quite a lot, but it wasn't didn't murder like where it kind of just happened occasionally, or was it like just had a regular thing in Anglo-Saxon England?
Well, I think in the book I've managed to find it's just short of 100 cases. That's what I managed to pull together, and the book covers a period of for 450 years, sort of mid 7th century to mid 11th century. I can't do the maths. So if you look at that as a percentage, it's really not that high. But this is high profile murders that somebody decided it would be a good idea to record. There may have been other killings, and I do mention a few where I think, this was not death by natural causes. But even if you add those onto the total, it's still a relatively low number. What we don't know, of course, is what was going on, unnoticed, unrecorded, because the people who were writing the histories weren't interested. And the Anglo-Saxons, the women did have a lot of
and
rights.
like you said, there were podcasts to talk about it back then.
Exactly. The women had a lot of rights, really, and privileges compared with their later medieval counterparts. But even in a lot of the sources, even the high-profile women aren't always named. So, to try and find out what was going on with the peasants, as it were, is incredibly difficult. And all we've got are the law codes in those cases. And all we can say about those is if there's a law prohibiting something, there probably was a need for that law, because you don't legislate against a problem that doesn't exist. But their priority, as I've said, was not necessarily murder. It does seem that by and large that the Weregild, the compensation system, was working. But later kings did try and legislate against the feud. So, it wasn't necessarily completely peaceful. But we don't know, unfortunately, because they were kind of the newsroom editors of their day, and they were picking and choosing what stories to run and what stories got the headlines. So we just don't know what we don't know. We're relying on what survives to tell us, and what survives is often quite subjective. So it is really difficult. But I would say, on the whole, what I did do with the last chapter of the book was I didn't have the space to examine them fully, but I did pull together a lot of similar stories from the continent. And they're just as gory, they're just as bloody, they're just as brutal. So I don't think the Anglo Saxon kingdoms were any different from any others. I don't think they were any more barbaric or any more murderous than any other society at that time. It would have been fun, actually, to look at these continental murders in more detail and get to the truth of some of them.
Maybe that's your next book.
Well, it could be. It could be.
Again, I'm gonna repeat my question from earlier. Do we have archaeological evidence for some of these murders? I think you kind of already touched about it on some, but
Yeah.
again, with later Anglo-Saxon era, do we have some archaeological evidence there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we do have what we think are execution cemeteries, and it does look like the bodies were not particularly reverently buried. But I did allude to it earlier. There's a beautiful example of the synthesis of historical record and archaeological record. With, again, Athelred the Unready. I mean, there's a lot about him in the book. Ordering the massacre of all the Danes in England. It wasn't all the Danes in England, because a lot of them had by this time settled, intermarried, possibly didn't even consider themselves Danish anymore, but something clearly spooked him. And what happened, we're told, was that the Danes who were living in Oxford were chased by the townspeople into a church, which was then set on fire. Now, this is not some later chronicler telling us this story. This is the king himself, because a few years later he issued a charter for the rededication of that church, and he explained what he'd ordered. So we have it from the king himself that this happened. And then a few years ago, excavation work was being done at that particular area of Oxford, and some bones were dug up. And the crucial thing about these bones was that they showed evidence of charring, of having been burned. So not only have we got the historical document, it's actually from the king himself, sort of basically admitting what he'd done. And we have archaeological evidence that very, very strongly backs up what happened. So that's, I think we can be pretty sure that this really did happen.
So I think we're gonna end it up there. So before I go, of course, where can people buy your book, and where are your social media if people want to find you or have further questions about murder in Anglo-Saxon world, or of course about a previous episode on Mercia? And do you have any links you want to share in the description?
Yeah, so the book, I hope, is in most major bookshops. Obviously, it can be ordered online. If anybody wants to find me, probably the quickest thing to do is to go to my website, where you can find all my social media contact details and a way of contacting me directly. So that is anniewhiteheadauthor.co.uk, and you can find me from there.
Of course, if you want to read more about the gory murders that we talked about here and in more detail about some other murders we did not discuss, of course, check out the book Murder in Anglo-Saxon England, Justice, Virgil, and Revenge. I would highly recommend checking this one out, of course, and check out our other episode on Mercia, the rise and fall of a kingdom as well. Not America, but Mercia. But yeah, we did an episode of last year on Mercia. I would highly recommend checking it out. This has been about that H12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find us on podcast. If you are on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. That would be very nice. Or if you hate this podcast, you can give us 1. It's a free world, at least on this side of the continent. And if you are on Apple Podcast, consider writing a review. That would be very nice. If you're on YouTube, leave a comment. Do you have any more true crime history that you want me to cover? I'd be happy to do more episodes like this, or any other topic on Anglo Saxon England. It's always fascinating to go back to this era, and you're always welcome back to this podcast. Thank you so much for coming
Thank you very much.
on
Thank
again.
you.
And this, you can, of course, I almost forgot to say, you can find us on social media, on the Twitter, when we're not aged well, Instagram, for that aged well, or on Blue Sky, for that aged well. And of course, please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.